Good morning. It's 5:51 in the morning on July 27th, 2022, and I've been on the road for approximately half an hour. I'm on a pretty major road trip here. I'm headed to Manitoba, and I'm going to be covering pretty much 1,170 kilometers today.
I left my home in Edmonton, Alberta, and I'm headed to Lloydminster, Alberta, where I will cross over into Saskatchewan, passing through Saskatoon and Regina, before crossing over into Manitoba and heading to my ultimate destination, CFB Shilo.
Well, 1,175 kilometers later, here I am pulling into the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum. When I was in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia, I was an armored crewman in the South Alberta Light Horse, and later a truck driver with the 15 Edmonton Service Battalion in the Transport Company. So I wasn't in the artillery, so I'll try to interpret things as best I can.
Let's start our visit by examining the artillery pieces the museum has on display in its compound, starting with a couple of artillery pieces from the Communist Eastern Bloc. First up is an anti-aircraft gun built by Yugoslavia. Though communist, Yugoslavia, under its leader Tito, pursued an independent course separate from Moscow during the Cold War. The Soviet ZUP-4 anti-aircraft gun was put into service in the Red Army in 1949 and was effective against low-flying aircraft. Later variants such as the ZSU-23-4 were mounted on a tank chassis with radar guidance and were one of the deadliest anti-aircraft systems of the time. Moving further down the line, we come to a World War II German recoilless gun, designed as a light support gun for the infantry and paratroopers. Upon firing, some of the gas generated by the propellant was directed out a nozzle to the rear of the gun to offset the recoil of the gun, resulting in a large black blast that posed a danger to friendly troops up to 55 yards behind the weapon, which had to be kept clear to avoid severe burn injury. When I was in the militia between 1978 and 1982, we had a similar recoilless gun, which I'll discuss when we examine the indoor displays. As we move along, we come next to one of the most widely used artillery pieces of the German Army in World War II, the German Heavy Field Howitzer Model 18, first introduced to the Wehrmacht in 1935 and used in all the theaters of World War II and into the Cold War. The last of these guns was retired by the Finnish Army in 2007. Next, we come to the 5.5-inch howitzer, which was the standard medium gun of the Commonwealth nations in World War II. First issued to the Canadian Army in 1942, the gun remained in service until 1956, when it was replaced by the U.S. M1A1 155mm towed howitzer, which is what the gunners were firing in the opening credits for this video. We are now passing by the 3.7-inch quick-firing heavy anti-aircraft gun. This was the main heavy anti-aircraft gun used by the Commonwealth countries in World War II. Designed and built in Britain beginning in 1938, the gun was later built in Canada as well from 1943 to 1945 by General Electric. As we move along, we come to the German field cannon Model 1896, which was the standard German field gun in World War I. This gun has a unique camouflage made up of several irregular contrasting colors, called disruptive pattern camouflage. This type of camouflage was used in World War I. The idea was to break up the outline of an object to make it disappear into the background. There was something about this British heavy howitzer from World War I that struck my fancy. Its low stance reminded me of a pit bull ready to attack, and it just looks mean. We will now move on to this line of equipment dating from the Cold War. Starting with this truck-mounted launcher for the Honest John rocket system. The Honest John was the first nuclear surface-to-surface rocket in service with the U.S. Army and was intended to deliver tactical nuclear weapons as well as high explosives and nerve gas warheads. The Honest John was in service with the Canadian Army from 1960 to 1970 and was Canada's only surface-based tactical nuclear weapon system. The Swiss ADATS, which is an abbreviation for Air Defense Anti-Tank System, was in service with the Canadian Armed Forces from 1988 to 2006 and could be used to take out low-flying planes and helicopters as well as surface targets such as armored vehicles. We will now have a look at a couple of self-propelled artillery pieces, such as this Soviet example of a self-propelled howitzer that entered Red Army service in 1967 and is still in use to the present day, and this example of the British Abbott self-propelled gun, which was in service with the British Army from 1965 to 1995. We will now leave the exterior exhibits of the museum and go inside to continue our tour. As impressive as the exterior displays of the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum are, the interior is equally, if not more, impressive. One of the exhibits that brought back fond memories of my service in the Canadian Armed Forces Militia was this display of rifles that were in use during my service in the late 1970s and early 80s. The FNC-1A1 and the FNC-2, both of which were made by the Belgian company Fabrique Nationale and manufactured in Canada under license. The FNC-1A1 was the main rifle used by the Canadian Armed Forces from 1955 to 1985 and fired the 7.62 NATO round. The rifle could only fire semi-automatic, as the higher-ups thought that due to this high-power round, that the rifle would be too inaccurate if fired fully automatic. Some of my happiest times are of being on the range firing this rifle. The FNC-2 was very similar to the FNC-1A1, but was heavier and had a folding bipod for the forestock. Because of this, the weapon was steadier and could be fired fully automatic with accuracy. The FNC-2 was used by the Canadian Armed Forces as an infantry squad automatic. Remember earlier in this video when I mentioned that the Canadian Armed Forces had a recoilless gun similar to this German World War II model? Well, here it is, the 106mm recoilless rifle. These recoilless rifles had a 50 cal sighting gun fixed atop them, which was calibrated to the main barrel. The gunner would fire a tracer round from the sighting gun, and if he saw it hit the target, he would fire the main gun with confidence that it would also be on target. I remember being on exercise in Wainwright or Dundurn and seeing these recoilless guns bounding about atop a quarter-ton Jeep. And if you have any questions on why you didn't want to stand behind one of these guns when it fired, this photo should clarify the matter. In the late 1970s and early 80s, when I served in the militia, these guns were beginning to be replaced by the 84mm Carl Gustaf recoilless gun, which was lighter and thus more portable, with an equally devastating punch on target. Well, that's enough of my trip down memory lane. Let's continue on and see the rest of the exhibits in this wonderful museum. If you follow the museum's suggested path, you are taken on a journey of the history of Canadian artillery. Here's an unusual piece, the 1-pounder pom-pom that was designed by Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, and saw use by both sides in the Boer War and World War I. It was the first automatic cannon. We are now passing a Canadian gunner with the 9-pounder rifled muzzle-loading gun as he would appear during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Here we see a model of a gun crew fording a river during the Riel Rebellion. Moving along to the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, we see a Canadian gunner with the 12-pounder rifled breech-loading gun in use at the time. Now we are passing through World War I and a display of a gun bunker, which is what the gunners in the opening sequence were firing from. Moving on to World War II, we pass by a Canadian crew manning their Beaufort's 40mm light anti-aircraft gun during the Blitz. Here we have a Canadian gun crew with their quick-firing 25-pounder gun, along with the limber that was used to transport the ammunition for the gun, and the tractor used to move both. And now we are at the present day, with a Canadian soldier manning his Javelin surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile. There is much more at the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum that I'll not get into in this video. If you ever find yourself on Highway 1 between Brandon and Winnipeg, Manitoba, I'd highly recommend that you take a side trip to CFB Shilo and visit the Royal Canadian Artillery Museum. Before leaving Manitoba and heading home, there is one more stop I need to make in Arden, Manitoba, to visit the Lansdowne Municipal District War Memorial that is in that town, to pay my respects to my great-uncle, Private George William Watson of the 27th Battalion, City of Winnipeg, CEF, who laid down his life for King and Country in World War I on the 6th of November, 1917. Thank you, Uncle George, for your noble sacrifice.